Good morning. We're here to pronounce, or announce, I should say, our recommendations for a supplemental budget to the legislature. As you know, the November forecast projected that in the current two-year budget cycle that we're in, the state of Minnesota faces a $1.2 billion budget deficit. So the proposals that we'll outline for you today will address and resolve that deficit. Let me first start out by saying that Minnesota, of course, is not alone in this predicament. I think with the exception of North Dakota and Montana, every other state has the same or similar type of budget challenges. The historic drop in the national economy has caused a historic drop in state revenues in Minnesota and states all across the country. Minnesota has experienced a multi-billion-dollar drop in revenues as a result of the economy, and so the spending expectations and requirements need to be aligned with the revenue that's currently available. As many of you know, so much of Minnesota state spending is on autopilot. That's unfortunate. So much of it is now also micromanaged by the federal government, which is also unfortunate because it begins to narrow the options and flexibility that policymakers have to adjust budgets in a proportionate way or even a comprehensive way, because so many parts of the state's budget are off bounds or limited because of those circumstances. In any event, though, we have presented a budget that does these things. First of all, it delivers on the promise of setting priorities and making sure that our most important areas are protected from budget cuts. Those include, first and foremost, our programs relating to veterans and members of the military and military support programs. Certainly also includes core state public safety functions, and it also includes K-12 education and classrooms. So those are amongst the state's highest priorities. They are not impacted by this budget. There's a few agency cuts, state agency cuts for all bureaucracies that affect their K-12, or not K-12 department, but the Department of Education. But as a general proposition, K-12 education is not impacted at all by this budget. In very quick terms, all of this is lined out for you in the documents that are before you. But if you look at the sheet that looks like this, it gives you the high-level overview of the budget cuts. I'll just go through those very quickly with you. It shows the top number being $1.2 billion in, you don't have those? Bruce? Well, do they have any of the paperwork?
Yes, they've got the news release.
They have the news release? Well, the high-level view of it is on the bottom of the news release. You'll get another summary sheet in just a moment, bottom of page 1. And then there is a larger packet that's coming out to you that has all the detail. And if you want even more detail, that's on the MMB website. It'll be available to you immediately following the press conference. But the kind of high-level overview of it is this: a $250 million reduction in aids to local units of government. Sometimes we use the term local government aid as a term that implies all local government aid. You should be careful, though, because there's more than just LGA. As a term of art, that applies to cities and towns. But there's county aid, there's market value credit, and other aids to local units of government. So when we talk about it in this context, we talk about it comprehensively. It's not limited to just the program for aid to cities. That program, by the way, comprehensively, we appropriate and spend about $2.1 billion a biennium for all aids and credits to local units of government. This proposal will reduce that by about $250 million. That does come on top of a previous unallotment of $300 million, but the total pool or pot of money that goes into this category, broadly defined as local government aids and credits, is $2.1 billion. So this is $250 million of that $2.1 billion pot. The next item or category is $347 million reduction in health and human services spending. This covers a broad array of items and programs. We won't go through them all, but some of the larger items include these: a change in eligibility in the Minnesota Care program for adults without children from the current level of eligibility being 250% down to 75%. It also includes a 2.5% long-term care provider rate reduction, but that's also accompanied with a call to repeal the long-standing equalization law in Minnesota, which prohibits long-term care facilities from charging private pay patients differently than they do public pay patients. That's something that the long-term care facilities and providers have sought to achieve or be able to do for many years. I think Minnesota is one of the only states in the country that prohibits that type of charging approach or rate equalization approach. It also converts the general assistance program from its current form to more of a cash grant emergency assistance program. And if you want more details on that, Cal can explain that. We also have on the sheet, going down, the next one is extended Medicaid match. The federal government has signaled they're going to extend the Medicaid match, the so-called enhanced FMAP, not just to the end of this calendar year, but into at least the next half of the next calendar year and maybe beyond. So we booked $387 million for that scenario. Higher education institutions are reduced by $47 million. I have to tell you, they got off relatively very easily here. Because of the way the federal law works, this is the most that we could cut them with the handcuffing effects or mandating effects or maintenance of efforts effects that are now imposed on higher education funding. In proportion, this is a very light cut for them relative to their take on the overall budget and their proportion of the overall budget. If we weren't restrained by the federal law, this is an area we probably would have reduced more. And then the rest, $181 million, is in miscellaneous cuts and the like to state agencies and other state programs. In general, it won't fall exactly this way, but in general, state agencies will take about a 6% cut. Again, it'll be differentially visited upon different agencies and programs, but in general, on average, it's going to be about a 6% cut. We're also asking the legislature, as part of this proposal, again, to ratify the unallotment decisions that were made last summer. That would go a long ways towards not only stabilizing and bringing certainty to the budget outlook for the state, but it would also help a great deal in the tails, the so-called out biennium deficit. For people who speak English, you know, Minnesota, unlike many other states, has a 4-year budget planning window. So we not only deal with the current 2 years, but we at least keep an eye on what's coming up in the 2 years after that. Depending on whose methodology you want to use, you can get different numbers for what the deficit is in that biennium. But in any event, if you make the unallotments permanent and you take the actions that we're outlining today and make them permanent as well, you'll see a dramatic reduction in the so-called out biennium projected deficit, and that's reflected on the summary sheet as well. And then in addition, and finally from my perspective, we're also outlining as part of this budget all the initiatives that were addressed in the state of the state or otherwise. We won't go through those all, but they're all included in these budget numbers and paid for. But of a particular note are the job creation tax package that we outlined in the state of the state. You'll see that on the second page of the press release. That includes the 20% reduction in the corporate tax rate and a 20% reduction in the exemption, or creating a 20% exemption for taxes paid by small businesses, the angel investment tax credit, the research and development tax credit improvements, the capital gains exclusion for qualified investments, and incentives for companies to invest in small Minnesota businesses, sometimes referred to as CAPCO. Those are all in the budget and all paid for and referenced in more detail on the second sheet of your page. And then lastly, before I turn it over to our Commissioner of Management and Budget, I'll just note, if you look at Minnesota's posture in terms of the way forward, Minnesota continues to lead, or is at or near the tops of the country in just about every quality of life measurement. That's a good thing. Minnesota, if you look at where are we out of balance, people like balance between the competing theories of the left and the right. You know, we are not out of balance in terms of the quality of our amenities, our arts, our culture, our education, many other measurements. We are definitely out of balance, though, when it comes to our tax climate and our business climate and our job climate. So as you look at, as we look at as a state, as policymakers, recalibrating the needs of the state of Minnesota to look to see where are we out of balance, where are we out of sync with competitive forces, the market, where do we lead, where do we not lead. It's pretty clear that we lead in most measures of education, of healthcare, of human services, of arts, of culture, of amenities, things like that. We do not lead and need substantial improvement when it comes to economics, marketplaces, businesses, job growth, private deployment of capital, entrepreneurial activity, investments in new businesses, investments in new buildings, job growth, and the like. So as we have this debate about recalibrating, rebalancing our state policies, we need to rebalance them towards the areas where we are in obvious default or deficit or misdirection, and that is we need to improve our job climate and our business climate. The other areas we continue to do at or near the tops of the country and in almost every category. With that, I'll ask Tom Hansen to make a few comments. Cal Ludeman, our Commissioner of Human Services, is here as well if you have questions, and then we'll take your comments. Tom.
Governor, thank you. I just wanted to go over a few other points for you to consider as you review our supplemental budget. The $1.2 billion, remember, is a moving target, and we will have another forecast on March 2nd, so keep that in mind. The 1.2 is 6% of what's remaining, a deficit of 6% of what's left unspent. And remember, we have a 2-year biennium. We're 7 months into it. We have 17 months left. We were limited on some of our options in putting this budget together. The federal, remember, we received a year ago, we received federal stimulus money. And as a requirement of receiving that stimulus money, we had to, in the case of higher ed, we had to not increase higher ed greater than 2008 and 9, but also not decrease it below 2006. And it's the same with K-12. So we have reduced, we were limited to our higher ed reductions to $47 million, 36 to the U and about 10 million to MNSCU. And that takes them to their 2006 levels. In healthcare, we received $1.7 billion of federal medical assistance program money. And we are required to receive that money not to reduce eligibility. And they have a fairly expansive definition of that, so we had to keep that in mind, and Commissioner Ludeman can talk about that. We reduced, as we went forward and looked at our agencies, we reduced operating budgets by 6% and program budgets by 6%. You will notice that we extended that to all funds. As you go through, pay particular notice to what's general fund, what's other funds. Everybody we felt had to participate. We transferred savings from other funds to the general fund. There are no one-time gimmicks in this budget. We don't shift. We retain the 7327 K-12 shift that we did a year ago, and that was the House proposal. We didn't use the budget reserve, there is none, and we still have a $350 million cash flow account. No one-time solutions. It carries just items that carry forward. We have, in addition to other funds, you'll pay particular note to the Healthcare Access Fund. The eligibility reductions that the governor talks about is savings in Minnesota Care that we carry forward into the general fund. The other important point to keep in mind that ratifying our unallotments, the unallotment authority of the governor is, and the Commissioner of Management and Budget is only in the current biennium. So any reductions we make are only current up until the end of this biennium, June 30th, 2011. Then anything we've done blinks back on. So by ratifying, and we talk about why it's important to ratify our unallotments, it makes a big dent in our deficit in 2012 and 2013. With that, the one more thing I want to say are the governor's budget takes the 2012 and 13 gap from $5.4 billion down to $2.4 billion. With that, I can turn it over back to the governor.
Yeah, thanks.
Commissioner Ludeman.
Okay, well, we'll take questions. Operator, you might want to just ask people to queue up now, and we'll come to if there are questions from those on the phone in just a few minutes after we take some questions from those in the room. You want to go ahead and give that instruction now?
Okay, and to ask a question, it is *1 and record your name and media outlet when prompted. Please make sure your line's unmuted. If you need to withdraw your question, it is *2. So again, *1 and record your name and media outlet. Also, this call is recorded. You may disconnect this time.
Thank you. So with that, we'll take questions from the media in the room, and then we'll come to those on the phone.
Governor, do you anticipate there to be layoffs due to the cuts in the state agencies and the local government aid?
Yes, there will be, Tom. We don't have that quantified, but there's, you can't insulate all of government from layoffs. All of the private sector is experiencing layoffs, wage freezes, furloughs, terminations. So we're going to have some of that. We're going to strive to try to minimize it, obviously, but it's not realistic to think that there aren't going to be any layoffs, and there should be. I mean, if everybody else is having to manage with those kinds of parameters, government should do the same.
The changes to Minnesota Care, how many people do you think that will affect?
It'll affect up to 20,000, 21,000.
And others in human services program?
Total? You have a total number of people impacted by the changes in human services, Cal?
Be about another 20,000.
So 40,000 total, affected in some fashion.
In some fashion.
Could be a reduction in benefit, not necessarily an elimination or a change in reimbursement or payment, so up to 40,000 total.
Governor, just to be clear, 20,000 will lose their health coverage, but another 20,000 will be affected?
Well, Don's question was how many will be affected in total, Tom, in some fashion, in some degree, by all of the health and human services changes. And when you see them, it goes on for, many, many lines, pages actually. So it could range from somebody being impacted by a reimbursement rate to somebody being eliminated from eligibility or the like. But 20,000 on the health care piece, up to 20,000 more to some degree on the broad human service impacts.
Governor, you say that there are no gimmicks or one-time solutions here, but isn't that quarter of your plan here one-time money from the federal government, and it's money that's not even in hand yet?
Well, two things. So, I don't think it's fair to say there aren't some one-times in here, because one of the things we decided is if you look at agencies and programs that are insulated from the general fund because they got all their funding dedicated, they get off scot-free in these budget pinches because everybody else is getting their budget reduced, having to lay off people, and those programs keep chugging along. So in select areas, not in all areas, and it's within the 181, and it's a very small part of the overall number, we took some of those funds as well. And I don't know if that's permanent, but the expended FMAP, the federal government has made signals. We don't know for sure whether that's going to be one time or permanent. They certainly look like they're poised to pass it for 6 months or another year. But there's also some suggestion they may make some version of enhanced FMAP permanent as well.
But you're counting it as your solution, and you don't have it yet, right?
Yeah, and if we don't get this, this spring or by the time the legislature's out, then I think we need to pull that piece back and reduce state spending further, because it does need to be available and booked, before the legislature goes home. So that's something we're going to monitor very carefully, and if it isn't finalized or formalized, then we would have to pull that back and make other arrangements through additional cuts. Now, it has passed the House. It's in the President's budget. The leadership of the Senate have embraced it. So it appears like it's going to happen, but you never know.
Governor, there's mostly cuts in here, but there is some new money under Veterans Affairs. Can you talk about why you wanted to spend that and find some new money there?
Well, there's a number of things, Mary, that there's some ups. There are not a lot of them, but because of the various initiatives that we proposed this fall and the tax changes and the like, there are some programs or areas that have received an increase. Those reflect either new initiatives or us saying they are of such importance or need that they need to be improved or increased, and that would include some of the veterans programs.
Governor, the changes that you are proposing for Minnesota Care eligibility, will that affect any of those whom you are transferring over from GAMC, or supposed to be transferred over to GAMC?
No, I don't think so, but maybe Cal can confirm that.
No,
Cal?
that's correct.
Retain coverage.
Yeah, the 75% of federal poverty guidelines would allow all those folks to be scheduled for auto-enrollment into Minnesota Care to be automatically eligible for Minnesota Care.
You're going to 75% of poverty just for
Adults without children. And again, there's only 3 or 4 states in the country that even have a program like that. I mean, both on the GAMC side and on the Minnesota Care side, single adults without children are typically not covered much or at all, certainly not at Minnesota's level. So the 250% level would have been the most generous in the country. And the problem we have is you now have a Minnesota Care program and related activities in the Minnesota Care account that are out of control. That account's going into deficit in the next year or 2 or 3, and as it does, under state law, the general fund has to infuse money into the Minnesota Care account. So by making this change, it will stabilize the Minnesota Care account so that that general fund transfer doesn't need to occur.
Governor, presumably Democrats will not be happy with a lot of these decisions, and it sort of sets up another battle. How do you see this playing out the rest of the session?
Well, again, it's well-meaning people trying to do the right thing for their state and tried to make it better, but with just different views and opinions about how to do it. And as I mentioned in the State of the State and in recent speeches, I mean, one view of it is, we're going to have such robust government programs that the value of that is going to more than make up for the extraordinary tax and government spending costs that are visited on taxpayers and businesses and job providers, and it will all work out as it always has in the 60s and 70s and 80s. I mean, another view of the world is a lot has changed since then, and we now live in a hyper-competitive global economy, and if you look where Minnesota is out of sync with the rest of the nation, it isn't on the social service side or the education side or the other side, it's on the economic side, it's on the market side, it's on the job side, the entrepreneurial side. And so as you have to make adjustments, which way do you want to adjust? And it's a legitimate question, and it's a legitimate debate. And most of the Republicans have one view of it, and most of the Democrats have another view of it. And so, you know, the traditional model in Minnesota is crank up the government as high as you can, highest in the nation, hope that the benefits or presumed benefits of that are sufficient to overcome the extraordinary costs that are visited on the economy. Another school of thought is that model now in this hyper-competitive global economy where places globally and even in the country aren't racing us to the bottom, they're racing us to the top with more efficient cost structures, more competitive cost structures, that we have to be mindful of that and we have to compete. And again, we don't have to be the lowest cost place in the country, but we can't be so smug about who we think we are and how special we are that you can think you can price yourselves out of the market and not have that have a discouraging effect on where people decide to deploy capital, create jobs, build buildings, do all the things it takes to keep a private sector economy going. And those are two just different views, and they're sincerely held beliefs by good people who are smart people. One side of it has a lot of historical momentum and culture here in Minnesota. The other side, I think, is looking to what's coming in the future, and that's what we have to reconcile.
So how does that happen? Where do you see reconciliation? Where does this go?
Well, in the near term, it'll be decided in the session, in the intermediate term, in the election this fall. But in the long term, the market's going to decide this. Competitive forces will decide this, and so it's not ultimately going to be up to the legislature. It's going to be up to the market and competitive forces. And regardless of what Minnesota does in the next year or two, in the intermediate and long term, this will be decided as to where these types of decisions get made and the reasons they get made.
Governor, talk more about local aids, please. What's being cut? Who are winners? Who are the biggest losers in this? Maybe the lesser losers. Talk more about that. What aids?
Yeah, I think on the local government aid pot, it's $2 billion. And again, that's local government aid, it's county program aid, it's market value credit. Ward, what are some of the other ones? That the whole basket?
A number of small boutique ones.
Some other boutique ones, but all in, it's $2.1 billion every other biennium. So they're taking if you take the unallotments plus this cut, that's about a 25% cut, so it's significant.
Are you doing a across the board cut, or are you county aids different than city aids?
Everybody's going to be impacted, Don. We are not affecting townships because of their small size and their relative inability to adjust on the fly or have any sort of flexibility in their finance model. So townships are exempted, and that's about it.
No small city exemption?
This time, no.
Okay, so is it a percentage locked off?
Here, Ward, come on up.
Yeah, Governor. Don.
You should introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Ward Inez, Commissioner of Revenue. This time, we cut the $250 million recommendation is evenly split between counties and cities. In the past, you may recollect, we did 2/3 was absorbed by the cities, 1/3 by the counties. This time, we did a 50-50 split. As the governor said, townships are not in, but small cities under 1,000 are. For purposes of clarification, when we did the unallotment previously, we did exempt small cities under 1,000 who are also deemed property tax poor. We've done that for almost every cut we proposed or effectuated. So this time around, everybody's in, all cities and all counties. For the $250 million cut, the worst case scenario for any city would be 8% levy plus aid and 4% for counties. And our runs will be up on our website by the time this press conference is concluded. Don.
Governor, Democrats will say again that what you're doing here is forcing property taxes up. Would you care to respond to that?
Yeah, that's why we've called for a property tax cap to be continued. There's one on currently, but it expires in about a year, Bill. We tried to get it at 3% to accommodate the legislative concerns. It ended up being at 3.9% with some exceptions for public safety and other things. So there's only one way you're going to really control property taxes, and that's do what many other states have done, what Minnesota has sort of done temporarily, and that's put on a property tax cap. So you can control those by adopting that approach. Don, I wanted to jump back to you and say, you know, on proportionality as it relates to this basket of local government aid stuff, it reflects two things. One is priority. You know, if you're going to protect military veterans and public safety and K-12 schools, some other things are going to have to be impacted more substantially. And it also affects the hand tying that came with the, you know, the federal government's management, not just through the stimulus money, but historically through their rules and regulations regarding human services. So the things that we can impact are being impacted more broadly, and then we made a conscious choice to set some priorities. And candidly, now and in the future, given what the likely economic outlook for the state is in the near and intermediate term, you can't have a $2.1 billion local government aid program. You just can't. I mean,
Governor, could you explain the healthcare access fund, how this is impacted in relationship to your budget? Just trying to figure this out.
well, the big piece, I think, is this time there may be some small pieces as well, but the big piece is if you have the Minnesota Healthcare Access Fund go into deficit, there's a legal obligation currently for the general fund to make up whatever deficit there is. So if you make adjustments that reduce the obligations of the Minnesota Care Fund, you relieve or reduce that obligation of the general fund to pay for it.
Governor, you may want to take some questions from Governor.
We'll do a few more here. And then, operator, we'll come to the phone in just a minute. Yeah, go ahead.
Governor, thank you. Can you talk your 6-point job plan here? You have a capital gains exclusion. Can you talk a little bit about how that manifests itself and what you hope will come of that?
Well, the theory, and I think the practice is this, you know, if you're about to have a capital event and you're a Minnesota resident, it doesn't take a genius to figure out you can avoid paying 7.85% of the transaction to the state of Minnesota by moving a year in advance of the transaction. And a lot of people and businesses do. It's not uncommon. And it's rational decision making. And so Minnesota offers no preferential rate for capital gains. It taxes capital gains as ordinary income. So most of the individuals impacted are small and medium-sized businesses, or not all of them, and they get taxed at our highest, in most cases, our highest income tax rate, which is 7.85%. If you add that, by the way, to the federal capital gains treatment, we have the 6th, Minnesota would have the 6th highest capital gains in the world, for sure the country and maybe the world.
Governor, there's a seeming mishmash of, just at first blush, of cuts to various boards that would be moved to nonprofit status. Can you talk a little bit about the criteria and thinking behind cuts to the various boards?
Well, there's some boards, I think, Sarah, you may be referring to, for example, the state's arts board. There's, what other one went to nonprofit status? Film board. There's groups like that that perform a helpful function, but they don't need to be government boards. They're well supported through philanthropy, community involvement. Government, if it wants to support it in the future financially, can make a grant to it, but they don't need to run and be staffed as government agencies. They can function very well given how high functioning they are, the support they have, the people involved as a NGO.
Governor, presuming that the courts don't impair your allotment authority in any way, how open are you to legislative deviation from this plan?
Well, Lori, this, of course, is always just a starting point for the discussion, and given the makeup of the legislature, namely overwhelmingly DFL, I suspect they're not going to like much of this. They don't like almost anything we propose or say or do. So we expect that, but we encourage them to come up with their alternative proposals, and if they've got other ones, we'll certainly welcome those. We'll see what they have to say.
Are you worried about allotment funding in this session is necessary?
Well, we'll use that as kind of a last resort. You know, obviously, for the reasons I mentioned in the state of the state and other times, we have time compression now. And the state general fund is spending, is it 43 or 46 a day? $43 million a day, and so we're spending $2 million more a day on average than we take in. And each day that goes by is one more check that goes out the door, one more appropriation that goes out the door that you can't reduce or impact. So we're going to give the legislature a full and fair and robust opportunity to help us as partners sort through this and solve it. But you can't let this drift forever, because you know, this biennium ends next summer of 2011, And if you don't make substantial progress on this deficit and you are the next legislature or the next governor and you show up here next January with only 6 months left to go and you have this large of a number staring you in the face, it becomes very, very difficult.
Governor, 2 questions. It seems like there are some scattered fee references here. I wonder if
Scattered what references, Brian?
References to fees, and I wonder if
fees.
you can quantify what the fee increases are, if any. And
We
secondly,
know.
it seems like there's an acknowledgement that there will be some red ink left as you leave. Are you starting to...
Brian, I think if you look through there, there should be almost no fees, and if there are, they're de minimis. I mean, it would be almost negligible compared to the numbers, and maybe have to relate to the particular program, but there's nothing of substance relating to fees.
And secondly, are you starting to acknowledge that there will be some red ink in the state budget as you leave? It looks like you can only cut pretty much 2/3 of the 12-13 budget count.
Well, the next biennium, of course, is just an estimate, so we don't balance the future out biennium. It's never actually balanced if you go back and look at it in history. So it's just a best guess of what the budget's going to look like 3 years from now or 4 years from now. And there'll be multiple forecasts between now and then, and the revenues and the expenditures will fluctuate by billions of dollars, as it always does. So the good news relatively is that this number now, if you take the unallotments and do what we propose today, is down to a bit over $2 billion. That's still a lot of money, but it's manageable compared to the overall size of the state's budget.
Specifically, how will you do reductions in your own office?
Yeah, we'll take the same % cut as everybody else.
And specifically, how will that work in your office?
We-
In your office?
We'll reduce spending and probably have people, we'll reduce spending overall, including personnel impacts.
Governor, where does in the K-12 whole farmland strategy here, where does early childhood preschool program, how does that work in the budget?
I don't know if, does that impact it at all? Early childhood, preschool? Was there a Head Start piece? Was there a Head Start piece, Jim? No? John, we'll double check that, but I think not impacted.
Could you explain a little more fully the long-term care implications of this? I think I heard you say that reutilization is over, or in this budget, is that right?
Yeah, 2 things. One is there's a long-term care rate reduction of 2.5%, Lori, which is challenging, but I think doable from most of the long-term care facilities in Minnesota. But recognizing that, we'd also like to give them something that they've long sought, which is to end the current equalization laws in Minnesota, which prohibit differentially charging private pay patients. If you allow them to do that, many of them will realize additional revenues that will help a great deal. And again, I think Minnesota, correct me if I'm wrong, Cal, is one of 2 states in the country that have the current law. And so that will help. I don't want to say it's going to offset it perfectly, but it will help soften the impacts of the revenue. Anything beyond that, Cal?
Governor, where does this proposal leave the GMC bill that's making its way to the legislature? Are you likely to veto that?
Well, we're still going to look at that closely, Tom, and I've been studied it a little bit over the weekend even, but it appears what they've done is, notwithstanding many years of us saying, please reform the program, they have simply recreated the program with no change in eligibility, no change in benefit set, basically just recreating the GAMC program in all of its substance and ways as it was, done a little kind of a spin cycle on some money, and then cut the provider reimbursement rates in half. That's not reform, and it's concerning to us at this point.
So you would like to veto it in its current form?
Well, I think it still has to get through the House, and there's to be a conference committee perhaps, and so there may be some additional changes. So we'll see. But again, this is a program, the GAMC program, that is a great case study for most of what's going on in the human service area. It's, let me just finish, please. You have a GAMC program that was growing over 30% every 2 years. Tom, it's just absolutely out of control, unsustainable. Again, we had many years of asking Senator Berglund and others, please slow this down, please reform it, please introduce some of the pay-for-performance elements or reforms. Got ignored for all of those years, and now we've unallotted the program, and now they're coming back with what appears to be almost the exact same program in terms of benefit sets and eligibility. So that's disappointing, and it's concerning.
Governor, do you see LGA as
Outmoded?
outmoded?
No, it's not outmoded. It's just we had a $4 or $5 billion drop in state revenues because of the historic economic crisis, and so we have to make reductions in spending, and there's some things that are more important than others. LGA is not as important as the things that we're protecting and preserving.
That $20 million in tax cuts in this biennium, how do you pay for it?
It's paid for through all the changes that we've made in the budget bill, so it all balances out on the sheets that you have. It's part of the reductions in spending.
Is there any provision to pay for that in the next biennium, or is that?
Yeah, it's all paid. I mean, when you say pay for, it's just, you know, the measure against whether it's paid for or not is whether the budget balances at the end of the biennium. And so it always gets paid for. The state always balances its budget. It must balance the budget. It will never not be so. So any notion that there's going to be an imbalanced budget now or in the future is, you know, fictional. It's not going to happen.
It will be the next governor's and the next legislature's responsibility to balance.
The legislature and the governor have to balance the budget constitutionally for the current biennium, as we have done every 2 years that we're here. So, for example, when I became governor in November, I got a knock on the door from Tom Stinson and whoever was with him saying that the budget is now $4.8 billion. Good luck to you. Much of that, by the way, in the current biennium that we were in. So the budget will always balance. It must balance every 2 years.
Your tax proposals would add another $300 million or so to the deficit in the outlay end of the year. That's what we're trying to get.
Yeah, well, the deficit projected will take it down to 2.4. But again, the forecast changes radically, regularly. So you don't know whether this thing's going to go up or down significantly 3 years from now. You can't have a best guess, but history shows it bounces around pretty good. But I would also tell you this. This scoring that we use is static scoring. In other words, it assumes that if you make tax changes, there's no positive effect in the economy now or in the future. It's frozen in time, and it says if you take these revenues away on today's economy, this is what you would lose. There is, at least informally, I think, a recognition that these have dynamic qualities. If you make changes in the tax code that stimulate behavior, encourage investment, do an uptick in positive economic growth, it will have a positive effect. Now, that may take 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, who knows, but they will have a positive effect over time. But what I'm here to tell you is that if we don't do something like this, and this is modest, I mean, we should be doing this, we should be cutting the corporate tax rate in half, we should be reducing individual income tax rates by a half, we should be moving to, you know, consumption taxes. This is a spit in the ocean compared to what should be done. Minnesota is so out of step in terms of its tax structure from a competitiveness standpoint. Putting these small changes or modest changes in the tax code is the least of our worries. We should be tripling or quadrupling the effects of this, in my view. That being said, the way that you pay for it is you reduce spending in other areas because this has to be done. If you, again, where I started, look at where Minnesota is out of balance. It is not out of balance in the sense that we have poor education results, or we don't do enough in human services, or we don't give enough in local government aid, or we don't do enough for arts or the culture, or we don't do enough for the outdoors. We are at or near the top in just about every one of those measures in just about every one of those categories. And that's a good thing, and we want to keep it that way. But in relative terms, if we don't start making this a state where private sector businesses want to be, stay, grow, and start, all that other stuff's going to go out the window because nobody's going to have the ability to pay for any of it.
Governor, given that level of spending, how would you judge the ability of the various targets here to handle these cuts? I mean, there could be some broad disruption of Minnesota life, or handle it pretty good, or how would you assess that?
Well, many of these cuts are very, very difficult, Eric. So these are not easy. These are challenging times, and then you layer reductions on top of them. You know, it makes it very, very difficult. But we have to make our budget balance. We have a historic drop in revenues. You have one of the most highly taxed states in the country. Adding more tax burdens onto the state is not the way forward. So we have to live within our means, tighten our belts, and do what everybody else is doing in this economy.
Governor, on the bonding bill that the House is presumably going to pass today, is that if the $89 million for Orange Lake is not in it, is it unacceptable and is it vetoable in its entirety?
You know, if they put a bonding bill on my desk that is able to fund arts and civic centers and, you know, Arrowhead Recreation Center, but they can't fund a facility to lock up and keep sex offenders off the street, that bill's going to be significantly disrupted and reshaped. Well, we'll see. Stay tuned. We'll switch to the phone call. Operator, go ahead and queue up any questions that may be on the phone.
We have no questions from the phone. phone line.
All right.
And as a reminder, if you do have a question, it is star 1 and record your name and media outlet.
Anyone else in the room? Sir, do you have something? Yeah.
Yes. Yes, Governor, one figure that doesn't seem to get on paper or into the discussions is what dollars would be available to the budget process if we're going sending our guards around the world?
Our National Guard?
Yes.
Well, when they are deployed into war zones or international settings, they go on what's called Title 10 federal duty, so it doesn't affect the state budget at all.
Governor Pawlenty, last week on Jerry Miller's show, Mayor Coleman, the current Mayor Coleman, said that you're going around the country bashing our poor business climate and not talking about our quality of life, educated workforce, things like that. They replayed the cut this morning for Sarah Janicek's benefit. Are the decisions really being made just on those dollars and cents rather than quality of life and just the attractiveness of Minnesota and the people here?
John, it's a matter of balance like everything else. There isn't a silver bullet. It's not about one thing. So Minnesotans and all of us like balance. So there's lots of different pieces that are all important to the total picture. But if you assess each of those pictures and look and see where is Minnesota out of balance, where is Minnesota out of sync, it's not in our education performance scores, although there's exceptions to each of these. But in general, we're at or near the top in education, we're at or near the top in healthcare, we're at or near the top in human services, we're at or near the top in culture and arts and the like. And varies depending on which interest group does the study. But it's top 5 or 10 in just about everything. But there's one thing that we're not at the top in. That's in the most important category. And that is we have a very, very challenging business climate and job climate in Minnesota. And so our quality of life, whether people enjoy all the Vikings games or they enjoy the arts or civic involvement or the like, if they don't have a job, all those other things and government revenues are going to get more and more challenging in the future. So again, I'm not talking about it being all one way or all the other. I'm just talking about as you recalibrate, as you reset the needle in balance between these competing forces, which direction do you need to reset it towards in light of what part of it's out of balance? And with that in mind, I think the answer from my view is you've got to make this a more pro-jobs, pro-business state. I mean, you got most of the major businesses in Minnesota saying, look, nice place, love to be here from a headquarters standpoint, but our growth is elsewhere. It's just too darn expensive being here. And that's not going to work in the future if you have a business climate and job climate like that.
Governor, in the last few weeks, you made a lot of comments kind of critical of the school districts and some of the labor agreements that have been reached. In light of that, how difficult was it to keep K-12 protected and not have any accountability for that?
It's very difficult. It's very difficult. And one thing Minnesota and most of the rest of the country is going to have to come to grips with in the future is the interplay between pensions and labor law and the way that we settle public employee contracts and the financial realities that confront that. And so at the very moment that we had school districts complaining about how they're going bankrupt or how they can't keep up, you've got the collective bargaining unit for the Edina teachers turning down a 6 or 7% increase in pay, not enough. You've got the St. Paul School District settling for a $10 million increase in just the teacher salary settlements alone, not including all the other employees, the custodians, the bus drivers, everybody else. They got a $20 million deficit. They coughed up half of it in a salary settlement. Probably another half of that remaining half is in the custodian, bus driver, kitchen worker. You got people who are under employment arrangements where they get to retire at early ages, have the government pay for their health care for the rest of their life. They're on defined benefit plans, so if the stock market goes down, they're protected fully. The rest of us have our 401ks pounded into the ground. I mean, you got a two-tier employment system. It used to be that public employees got less money but better benefits. Now in many cases they're getting more money and better benefits than you see in the private sector, and that's going to have to come to a head. You're going to see it come to a head in California first. You're going to see it in New York second. There's going to be calls for help for those states, and they're going to have to massively reform. And it's in part going to evolve around public pensions, public employee collective bargaining. I've walked you through this before, but in school districts, almost all the money's in people. There are people demands. If you go COLA, step and lane, pension, health insurance benefits, they can't settle those contracts, for zero very easily, because the school board takes it in the shins for trying to have a strike or even thinking about a strike. The costs of running school districts, the costs of running the university are going up faster than the private economy, in part because of this issue.
Governor, one question on your tax bill, you pay for most of the tax bill in the next biennium. If it's such a good idea, why aren't you paying for more of it now?
We are paying for it now, but the impacts of it ramp up over time, so it's fully paid for in the current biennium.
Governor, there's folks that are still out of work in this.
But if I could jump back, I'm sorry on this. We called for in the state having tenure changes for teachers. You got this January 15th negotiating deadline where if the school districts don't settle, they have to pay a fine or a penalty, but the unions don't. The whole system is dramatically tilted towards the unions, but the problem is, if you're a Democrat, you don't cross them or you're toast. That's the way it works.
So you're protecting K-12 for what?
I'm protecting them because I don't want to take my frustrations out on the bureaucracy and the system on the kids who are in the system.
Last question, Governor.
Yet.
In the unemployment area, say that the fund in Minnesota is in danger, could face running out, and the federal, we don't know what's going to happen. A lot of folks are employed. Does your budget consider how to address that?
Yeah, there's a long history of how that works relative to the federal government. States, loan against their account, have to pay it back, and other times. But federal government keeps extending the unemployment, and so I think we're up to 75 weeks now for at the longest level. So we're up to like 5 years of unemployment for certain employees. Well, maybe I got that wrong. It's a lot. Well, I think for certain employees it's dramatically extended beyond that, but we'll double check.
An office of turnaround schools in the Department of Education in your State of the State speech, is that funded in this budget?
The Office of Turnaround Schools, it's part of the Race to the Top application.
Right.
Okay, thank you. I'll double check on the unemployment. I think it's, I don't think it's 75 months. But there are certain employees that are beyond 18.